All right. So we're just now at the top of the hour, and welcome back, everyone. It's good to see you all. Happy almost Halloween, or all Hallows Eve, as it were. And I'll go ahead and call up the our little share screen here to begin. So, as always, Benum Christen, and I greet Christ in you, and I'm happy to have you all back this morning. It's been a little bit of a hiatus with some things going on here. Let us begin this morning with our opening prayer. Creator God, fashion me not into who I think I am or who I want to be, but create in me a new heart, a humble spirit, formed in the very image of Christ, who took on human form, that we might at last be recreated in your divine image. Amen. So for those of you following in the book, our first reading comes from page 103. Actually, our second reading comes from 103 also, but we'll start here. So the less we are attuned to the love that deifies us, the less we are aware of the love that humanizes us. And therein arises the illusion of separation between ourselves and others, reinforcing a system of competition over collaboration. One person's success depends on someone else's failure. Desperate to fill the void that opens in the wake of authentic human relationships, we accept our lot as social consumers who are all but destined to value things over people. In a global economic and political system, proficient at protecting the consumer from the devastating effects of their own consumption, we become willfully blind to what we do and what we fail to do to others. We participate in systems that exploit the environment and increasingly militarize the world in order to protect our way of life. Such claims must then be bolstered by the wholesale creation of national myths designed to convince us of our benevolence and exceptionalism. This is often what we think of as the we-go, that collective ego that creates what Father Keating called mythic member consciousness or identity, a very dualistic approach to the world. So we'll pause there for our meditation this morning. Amen. So our second reading this morning, also from page 103. Having accepted the global narrative of us versus them, we have become adept at turning a blind eye and a deaf ear to any inconvenient truth that would otherwise expose the scaffolding of our self-constructed identities as individuals, societies, and entire nations who need to believe that we are good, innocent, and innocuous. This is precisely the milieu of discord and fragmentation in which our demons thrive. It is the wisdom of the world against which the cross stands as a sign of contradiction. So let us pray. Lord Jesus, when you ask me to follow you, I stumble along the way as you did on your fateful walk to Calvary. Your cross looms large, O Lord, and its shadow long. I am tempted to appear like one of your own rather than stand with you as a sign of contradiction. But when the shadow of your cross becomes light for the way, I see only resurrection all around. And death becomes life, darkness becomes light, and the world as I once knew it looks foreign, looks like your kingdom. I know that I am home. Amen. So good morning once again, and welcome back. As always, I look forward to any questions or comments you have, and you have the floor. Kathy, please.
Good morning, and thank you for that prayer. It's just beautiful. I certainly recognize the stumbling, and I think I'll be praying that a lot to maybe have a small opening to the last part of it. As I was preparing this morning, a two-part issue sort of arose for me, and I'd like to put it out there, whatever you could respond to. The first is that I really saw more clearly the environment in which I grew up, and which plays out a whole lot more now in terms of that whole competition over collaboration. I mean, my home was one where, my mother was competing with me, it felt like, from day one, and I never asked for the competition. And there was just so much jealousy and rage. And now at this point in my life, I'm really trying to work out building loving relationships with my siblings, but in the course of doing that, it just seems like it inflames that even more. And then on top of that, I've got childhood and adult trauma, PTSD, that I'm also working on. So that just adds to the mix in terms of the intensity of this sort of spiritual warfare that feels like it's playing out within. And so I'm feeling like a hamster on a wheel that it's about as fast as it can go, and I am still trying to make it go faster and faster, and it's a little scary, actually. So I'm just wondering, as we deal with these parasites, are they gonna do they resist and kind of push us to this point? Or I don't know if this is in reaction to trying to find that greater wholeness, it kind of that journey of your ending prayer, or what this is. But it's I meditate every day. I really try and come into the stillness to feel the presence, and the hamster is just often running again. So that's one thing, that's one level. But also, as I was preparing, I was thinking about Mark Zuckerberg's new announcement about his metaverse, and thinking about meta with one T, like in his metaverse, which is essentially a universe of a self-referential universe. Hello. And so it really concerns me. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. I muted the other.
Okay. It really concerns me in terms of our global universe, about this whole opening up of this metaverse, which seems like it's going to reinforce even more the fragmentation and the egoic identity. And so that's meta with one T versus meta with two T's, which is that loving kindness orientation, seeing our unity with all beings and the loving presence of the universe. Mm-hmm. So if there's anything in there that you can chew on for me, that would be wonderful.
Thanks, Kathy. In many ways, I feel that you've already intuited your response to the wheel, the gerbil wheel. And it is interesting. One of the things when I'm teaching meditation that I help my students understand is that normally we think of, say, our prayer word or phrase interrupting the flow of thought and bringing us back to a centered place, right? So I'm wandering off on some idea or fear or anxiety, and I recognize that, and so I introduce the prayer word again. And as Keating says, it's like that eagle who's starting to just lose some height and just flaps the wings once or twice and then is soaring again and sort of hovering. But what often surprises my students is that those two things don't always happen in succession, but end up happening concurrently. So we have that experience where we're introducing our prayer word and it's not disrupting the flow of thought, but happening at the same time as two currents kind of going past one another. And then suddenly you're like, wait a minute, I'm introducing this prayer word, but I'm still caught up in the thought, right? And I would venture to say most of you have come to that experience at some point in your meditation. And in a sense, I feel that, one of the points I make about asceticism, it is, in many ways, it is what I call prayer turned inside out. So it is the same dynamics we're facing. Instead of the logismoi, or thoughts as they were, that appear and distract and tempt, that stimulus is coming from the outside in, but our response needs to be the same, right? Which is to disengage and to get off the treadmill, as it were, of egotistical response or whatever that may be to whatever that external stimulus is. And that's one of the things I find revelatory it was for me anyway, to realize, asceticism really is the same dynamic that I'm practicing interiorly, but it's the way I engage the world or refuse to engage, as the case may be. And so I think you've already intuited the answer, and your experience, as you said, you try to enter that quiet, you try to enter that silence, but at the same time, there's that wheel still going around. And I feel that that's very similar to that dynamic. My students often that get surprised by that dynamic of the two currents, happening at the same time. And I think, like so many things in the spiritual life, it's the awareness of a way through it. And that's what I hear you saying, and what I'd like to sort of help frame for you, that you already know the way through it, which is to get off the wheel. And what I'm helping you to see is that it's the same dynamic, whether you're looking at those interior thoughts or the way you're engaging or refusing to engage the world, and to now notice when those two things are happening concurrently. And once you're aware of that, it gives you a greater ability to disengage from it. The sort of meta universe or metaverse, whatever he's calling it, is indeed a scary development when we see how manipulative social media really is, and not just on an overt level, but on a very subtle level. And when you're dealing, as you've acknowledged, with your formative years being born out of competition rather than undying support from the person that you needed that from, this becomes a real struggling, because you have, as I've often discovered, wherever our most foundational wounds are the things that cause us to limp most throughout life. It's very hard to overcome those formative type of years and whatever happens in those years, for good or ill, but also becomes the place where grace then abounds, because once you begin to acknowledge it and become aware of it, that the shadow of that cross becomes light, as I've said in that closing prayer. So I feel as though you're very much on the cusp of having the sort of, if you want to say, empowerment to realize this dynamic, both interiorly and in your social engagement, to understand some of the root causes, and then to understand what's at play, which is, as Martin Laird says, any riddle that we're presented with in the life of prayer, be that, mental distraction, physical discomfort, memories, anxieties, is always responded to with the same answer. And that answer is silence. And that silence is not merely a silence of the mind, but a continuing reminder of just the silence of the body and the heart. And I sense, like most things, you're going to find a greater struggle once you become aware, a greater resistance to that. But if you just continue to enter the silence and ask yourself, what does it mean in this moment right now to step off that wheel, even if I'm going to be on it again a moment later? What does it mean right now to step off that wheel and just to be in that peace? It's all good. And so even as you're meditating, if something arises in you and you realize there's that wheel happening, even in my meditation, oh, for just this moment, I'm going to step off. How? Through silence, a restoration of that inner stillness. Be attentive, Kathy, and I say this really to all of you, of that concurrent thing that happens. At least in my own experience, I find that's where I get tripped up. There are moments when the prayer word really does have that antidote type of effect. You know, the puppy mind goes after the bone and is quieted, but then other times it's all happening at the same time. And it takes me a while to realize, wait, something's not right, right? I somehow abandoned the practice thinking I've been doing it all along. So then you have to return in that moment, that invitation. Yeah. Does that make sense or give you a way of framing that a bit?
Well, my mind is totally confused, but my tears are starting to come out of my eyes, so some part of me has gotten it.
Well, give that some, instead of some thought, give that some heart attention, and then see either later in our talk today or even next time we're together if something hasn't come of that you're seeing breakthrough. Thank you for your comment, though.
Thank you.
As always. Yeah, of course. Richard, I think that puts you next. Good morning.
Thank you. Good morning, and hello all. It's been a while since I've spoken, but these two paragraphs move me so much that I feel at the moment nothing more ever needs to be written. It even has the term inconvenient truth, which Al Gore thought he invented. Yeah. And this was written prior to Al Gore, I believe. Here I am speaking into the silence that you're recommending, but I'll take the risk if I consider myself for a moment with a breath. And before my next thought arises, before this. The first sentence you read to us this morning, the less we are attuned to the love that deifies us, the less we are aware of the love that humanizes us. To me, speaks to my arrogance that I thought it was me specially being deified and not the wholeness. So the question arises, does the whole material creation moves to deification, and that we are all connected completely, and that whatever, who don't ask, John Donne, borrowed by many, don't ask for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. Everything that happens to my brothers and sisters is happening to me and maybe by me, and I deny my complicity in the system from which I grab and claim to benefit, and I'm certainly privileged within it. To recognize our oneness indeed allows human connection that is so satisfying. A couple of weeks ago, we were reading the scripture about what goes into your mouth doesn't create, but what comes out of your mouth. And the thought came, beloved son, if you paid as much attention to your heart as you do to your stomach, you would be more satisfied. And the satisfaction of this gathering, of human relations, of Sangha, of church together, making church together, is to me more satisfying than all that I can grab. And these two paragraphs open up worlds, and I'll get off with a thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah, a couple of comments to that. In all academic integrity and fairness, I did not invent the term inconvenient truth, and in fact was echoing. I'm not sure if Gore did, but I was certainly echoing him in that paragraph, with the hope that the reader would indeed pick up the connection that there's an allusion there to the way in which getting tied up and caught up in our economic and political systems has a devastating impact on the global environment. So thank you for picking that up, Richard. I'm not surprised you of all people did. And but in fairness to Al Gore, if it wasn't I who invented the phrase, I was certainly echoing him. The to your point, about ingesting, I mean, I think a lot of this, and it goes back also to what Kathy was saying, when Jesus teaches this teaching about it isn't what you eat that makes you impure, but what comes from the heart. What I'm reminded of is that he's speaking, of course, in a literal sense of food, but one could argue that we also ingest in other ways, what we ingest on social media, what we ingest in the world around us, that there's metaphorical ways in which we ingest things that become part of the toxins, right? That of the sort of a deleterious effect that it might have on us psychologically, emotionally, spiritually. And I think we do need to attend to what we are ingesting beyond mere food. But what does our diet consist of throughout the day? What am I attending to? What am I absorbing from the world around me? What am I drawn to? What is the junk food of the mind, or of social media, or of the internet, or of gossip, or of all of the, my ego that I'm drawn to? Where is my spiritual sweet tooth, as it were? And so in that sense, I think where Jesus is talking about, impurity and purity both come from the heart, not the stomach. What we feed the heart is a very important thing for us to consider in the spiritual life. Why sort of filter out with an intention of remaining more on a pure spiritual diet, beyond just a physical or food-based diet. So thank you, Richard, as always, for your comments, your reflections. I see something coming through. Oh yeah, we go. So for those of you who can see the chat, Carmen is asking about the term we go, regarding the global false self. Exactly. We go. It's a good question, Carmen. Another question about the provenance of my language here. I again did not make up that word, but I've known it for so long that I don't recall where I first heard it, to be honest with you. It's just been part of my vocabulary for a few decades now. It could have been a professor, or maybe even Father Keating. I don't know where I first heard the term, but when I heard it, it struck me as speaking to so clearly about what I think Father Keating spells out in his mythic member consciousness, that I thought, yeah, it's a perfect term for that. What happens when my ego builds on and informs and kind of reinforces other people's egos? Then you have we go, as it were. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Carmen. Carol, please.
Well, I just got back from a 6-day silent retreat. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
And Mary Millay was there, and we got to see each other. It was like,
oh, wow.
We got to stand there and stare at each other going, we couldn't talk, but we were like, wow, you're in person. You're a real person.
That's great.
But very much like Kathy, because I'm a nurse doing the COVID trials or whatever, I have been on a wheel for 2 years, but I'm, life is a wheel like that. And so it is good to take these silent retreats, because you get, you get off the wheel and you get a chance to stop the inflow. I mean, we didn't use phones, we didn't do social media, we didn't talk to each other, we just prayed and walked in nature. And very much I thought about you because your book was there on the book table, and they talked about the first nature, the tapes talked about the first book of God being nature and things like that. So, But I was just going to say one little thing. I love this country, and its history, despite all of its ills that we have to fix, and I think about my poor mother's generation, and I know she's on. I mean, I got to go to Normandy, France, and stand on those beaches and think about World War II. And there were times that we did pull together and collaborate with the rest of the world to try to go up against an evil. So I think I'm totally on board with what you're saying. It's the government is not going to solve our problems. No government is, and we can use our government to help solve problems, but we can't put our trust and our faith and our hope in our government, in any form of government or whatever. That's not. Don't confuse that with God's kingdom. In other words, so. And so I agree with that, but that doesn't mean we have to go to the other extreme and hate our country. So we just have to, if anything, we have to be responsible to stand up and help bring about the change. So, but I feel a lot of the anxiety that a lot of people are feeling, that our country may be at that 200-year mark where we're imploding on ourselves, and because we're no longer collaborating, we're hostile towards each other, and we're dividing, and coming about for different reasons than the reason your book is talking about. I mean, it would be lovely if we were imploding because we were seeing the error of our ways and wanting to change and move towards a more equitable society or whatever. But so I just wanted to say that I do love my country, but I love other countries too. And I don't have to hate my country, but I do have to acknowledge that, we wiped out one group of people to form ourselves, and we enslaved another. I mean, and we did that to get away from the British. So I mean, it's all hypocritical in the long run. So just to recognize that, and that God is not. I mean, and I guess we've seen in my lifetime, especially, how people have tried to put God into our government, or say that we were founded on Christian principles, and that always kind of makes me recoil a little bit, because I'm like, I don't, yeah. And I said this one time at my church, which is very liberal, and somebody yelled at me and got all angry at me about, I'm sick and tired of people criticizing America. And I was like, but it's not God. It's not God's kingdom. Can we agree on that? So anyway, that was my thought.
Well, Carol, yeah, thank you for that. And a couple of comments that come to mind. In fact, I'm tempted to respond with a short text from Thomas Merton's classic text, New Seeds of Contemplation, where he really speaks, among being one of the sort of best known contemplatives of the 20th century, he was also one of the most brilliant social commentators. And in the past, a lot of the church and its history would not have associated a monk being a social commentator. They were seen sort of as opposites. You're sort of disengaging from the world in the cloister. But Merton really understands that in his role as monk and contemplative, there must be some sanity spoken to the insanity that is culture. Remember, the early desert mothers and fathers said, society is a shipwreck and everybody's drowning. And in a sense, you have to get yourself to the shore so that you can be stable enough to throw life rafts for other people, or that you're just going to drown along with them. And I think in many ways, Merton's whole life and ministry expresses that. But I have a quote actually at my fingertips that I'm going to just read to you all now, because I'm not going to be able to say it better than him. And it's a citation of his that has spoken to me since I read this in high school. And for some reason, it just impacted me with its truth. And so I hope it will kind of cut through and speak to that now. Of course, he's writing out of the Catholic tradition, so he uses that term as opposed to more broadly Christian, but I'll leave it to you all to determine how to best interpret that element. So he says this, he says, the biggest paradox about the church is that she is at the same time essentially traditional and essentially revolutionary. But that is not as much of a paradox as it seems, because Christian tradition, unlike all others, is a living and perpetual revolution. And this, Carol, I think begins to speak to your comment. He says, human traditions all tend towards stagnation and decay. They try to perpetuate things that cannot be perpetuated. They cling to objects and values which time destroys without mercy. They are bound up with a contingent and material order of things, customs, fashions, styles, and attitudes, which inevitably change and give way to something else. The presence of a strong element of human conservatism in the church should not obscure the fact that Christian tradition, supernatural in its source, is something absolutely opposed to human traditionalism. The living tradition of Catholicism is like the breath of a physical body. It renews life by repelling stagnation. It is a constant, quiet, peaceful revolution against death. As the physical act of breathing keeps the spiritual soul united to a material body whose very matter tends always to corrupt and decay, so Christian tradition keeps the church alive under the material and social and human elements, which will be encrusted upon it for as long as it is in the world. The reason why Catholic tradition is a tradition is because there is only one living doctrine in Christianity. The whole truth of Christianity has been fully revealed. It has not yet been fully understood or fully lived. The life of the church is the truth of God himself, breathed out into the church by his Spirit, and there cannot be any other truth to supersede or replace it. And then he goes on to explain that and then to talk about how what this tradition calls us to is a revolution, because by its very nature, he says, it values the values and standards to which human passion are so powerfully attached are fought against, right? To those who love money and pleasure and reputation and power, this tradition says, be poor, go down into the far end of society, take the place among the least of all people, live with those who are despised, love other people and serve them instead of making them serve you. And he goes on, do not look for pleasure, but turn away from things that satisfy your senses and your mind, and look for God in hunger and thirst and darkness. And there's those dietary things I was speaking about to Richard, right? He's not merely talking about physical food here. And he says, take upon yourself the burden of the cross. That is to say, Christ's humility and poverty, and you will find peace for your souls. And this is how we end complete revolution that has ever been preached. In fact, it is the only true revolution, because all others demand the extermination of somebody else. But this one means the death of the person who, for all practical purposes, you have come to think of as your very self. This is very powerful, because all of this, we recognize all of essentially what we've been talking about this morning, the we-go, as it were, the failure of institutions over time, all of these things he's addressing in this short reflection to say, when Christianity speaks of the gospel as revolutionary, it's revolutionary not because it becomes, the oppressed who later become the oppressor. It's revolutionary because it demands the death of your own self. And this is what I intended to point to when I spoke in my prayer this morning about when the shadow of the cross becomes light for the way, that paradox of discipleship being cruciform on some very real level. The whole contemplative life is cruciform. Why? Because it demands the death of our own selves in order to rise again anew in Christ, as it were, to use that baptismal language. So for what that's worth, Carol, I throw that out as a better response than I could have given you, I think.
No, that's beautiful. And on the retreat, they mentioned a Thomas Merton quote that he used to say to the novitiates, something to the effect of, don't count on heaven because most of you won't be there. And he didn't mean you individuals. He meant you, your false self is not going to be there. Less
Right.
of you is going to be there. It's going to be God.
Right? Even you think will make it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right. This is how Olivier Clement, I talked about Olivier Clement, how he interprets Matthew 25 about the sheep and the goats, and says it's not two different people, but two aspects of every person. And that beautiful thing of however much ego, goat go, as we might call it, we associate with, that's not going to be there. That all gets burned away, so that it's only the sheep in us that ultimately, the Christ nature in us, right, that is redeemed. Is beautiful way of thinking. Linda, I saw your hand peeked up there for a minute. I didn't know if I inadvertently answered a question before you asked it, but by all means, if there's anything you want to share, go right ahead.
Yeah, I took my hand down.
So,
It was kind of up and down in my mind. But I guess since you named me, I will put it back up. The first sentence of this, and I won't be able to replicate it, but those who, if we can't see how much we're deified, can you quote that again, that first line?
absolutely.
Richard said it so well. The less we are attuned, I think, to the love that deifies us, the less we are aware of the love that humanizes us. I feel like I experience what you were talking about on the parallel, the thought and the silence running parallel. I don't experience that in meditation so much as I do in the human, in the walking in daily life, particularly with a relationship with my sister and my mother, who I feel like it's very charged for all sorts of reasons. I know that Richard Rohr used to talk about we need people to mirror our goodness, and they mirror something toxic. It's really painful. I walk in a room and they turn away or they say they have to go. It's that in your face. And I find myself with them getting really, I'm sort of replicating their behavior to me. And then underlying it is this, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me, a sinner. I'm sort of going, Linda, what, and I understand the ego, and it feels like this parasite that's digging inside me that's not loosening. And I guess the reason I lowered my hand was I thought this may be just too psychological, but it does feel like a spiritual question. And maybe you can help me know what my question is, and answer it too.
Well, I think, Linda, thank you for that. And thanks for your sort of vulnerability around that personal relationship. My sense is that, and I think at least you're opening up an invitation for me to say something I haven't yet, but that I think is important, which is, first of all, what you're experiencing is toxic. That is, for whatever interpersonal dynamics underlie that. It's hurtful. And I think it's important that you acknowledge that and recognize two things. One is that I think what you're doing, or what you're attempting to do while in their presence, by returning to the Lord's Prayer. Sorry, am I freezing up?
It might just be me.
No, you are.
Everybody's nodding. I think it's me.
Okay.
Let me just check, Linda. I'm just going to check if the door is open to where the Wi-Fi unit is, and if it's not, I'll open it. That might get me better reception.
You got to pull the rope between the two tin cans tighter.
Okay, I'm hoping that will help. We're out in the boonies here, and you're right about the tin cans. We call it the coconut internet. It's basically two soup cans with a line in between. It's about how we communicate out here. But Linda, to your point then. So on the one hand, I think that we really, you have to, on the one hand, in being merciful and compassionate with yourself, acknowledge this is a toxic situation. I don't think it's non-Christian to do that. I mean, Jesus called people out all the time for being, hypocritical, essentially what we would call toxic. He seemed to have absolutely no qualms about doing this, and neither should we. I think there needs to, being a Christian isn't being a doormat for toxicity or for abuse, that's for sure. So on the one hand, for you to be able to acknowledge, how do I cope with this when I need to be in the company of these two people who are family members and so on, and who are treating me this way? And what's the most compassionate thing I can do for them in that context? And maybe that is the returning to prayer, trying to remain centered, and so forth. But the other half of the question is, what can I do to remain compassionate to myself in the meantime as well? And what does that look like without me taking on aggressive or passive aggressive behavior in return, because that's exactly what's happening when you digest, to come back to what I was saying to Richard, when you digest their dynamics and their behavior, you are what you eat, in a sense, and this is what comes back. And we've all been in that situation where we get triggered, or you're just pushed to a point where you sort of start pushing back or engaging your own ego because of frustration or hurt or whatever. All very natural. So the real question, when Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself, we often forget the as yourself as the basis for what love looks like. And that is a very different thing than narcissism. It's self-respect, self-awareness for who I am as a daughter, in this case of God. So I would just say, Linda, to be really attentive to what you need to be doing to be compassionate to yourself where they're not. And that sometimes means creating boundaries, frankly, where you limit how much time you're willing to spend. And in many ways, it's kind of a pop psychology truism, but there really is value to that, to be able to say, what is the most compassionate thing for me to do, rather than me feel like I have to only be the only person trying to do the right thing here and working on my discipleship and fidelity to the practice. Where does that get grounded in a degree of self-compassion, where you can say, yeah, but I also don't have to keep subjecting myself to this. And sometimes that might mean just limiting and refraining how much time I spend. I don't know if that's at all helpful, but those are the two things that come to mind for me. Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Linda. Am I coming in a bit less choppy now? A little better. Okay. Okay, great. Any other thoughts then people would like to share this morning? Jennifer, please. Hi, good morning. Good to see you. It's been a while.
Good morning. Yes. Just following up on what Linda was asking, one thing that occurred to me is once we have sort of that self-compassion in place, those boundaries, is that when we're then maybe called to live out the idea of the forgiving victim in terms of, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Also knowing that we need forgiveness, for we know not what we do. How does that all come in? Sort of that knowing that people that are wounding us are operating out of their false self, not justifying their behavior, but sort of coming to that place.
Understanding it. Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that this is why, reading a chapter as we are like this, which is really focusing on demons and the dark side and the shadow and ego, especially dragged out in a format where we're only reading 2 paragraphs, could really feel like an intense and extended journey into that sort of shadowy side of our psyche and spirit. But you point to what I hope by the end of the chapter becomes what I hope for all of you is made manifestly clear, which is that precisely in examining and scrutinizing and having the spiritual, emotional, psychological capacity to scrutinize my own darkness is where compassion arises, is where the freedom to love arises, because it's what gives me only when I'm aware of my own need for mercy in a real sense, not just in a cognitive, like, oh, that's a nice concept, but really like, wow, I really screw up sometimes. Like, I really am a bag of contradictions. I really do compromise all the time. Like, when I start to see how this is happening in myself, the ability to have, not only to recognize, Jennifer, as you're saying, somebody else's ego, entrapment, materialism, lostness, wegoness, whatever words we want to put on that, then I realize, wow, we're just all in this muck together. And it does give me a deeper grace and capacity to be merciful. I mean, one of the things that come out of the reference you made scripturally is that Jesus has the capacity to do that loving in the midst of being crucified. That's a very hard thing for me to do. I mean, it's one thing after the battle is over and the resurrection is won that I could look back and say, okay, how can I now start being more compassionate, more understanding of this person's, woundedness and how that's hurt me, et cetera, et cetera. It's easy after the fact, or easier with a little distancing. But in the midst of, like, to Linda's point, when she's confronted with this overt passive aggression, or maybe, Linda, aggression, I'm not sure how you define it, real aggression, somebody turning away and ignoring you, pretending you don't exist. That's tough. That's the moment of crucifixion, right? How do you then, in that moment, move to that place of compassion that says, forgive them, they know not what they do? It's much harder in the midst of it. So I think we can all be forgiven for not always being able to do that in the midst of the crucifying moment. But at least, and that's certainly a goal for us to work toward, right? To really be able to move into such a compassionate place where we can do that. And like most things on the spiritual journey, that will not be a linear process. Sometimes you'll get it, sometimes you won't. The rest is up to God's mercy. So how do we, though, in the meantime, even if not in that moment, can we move to a place with that, so to speak, safe distance of a boundary, or the battle's over, or it's been settled? Can I then begin to cultivate compassion, see it in ways that maybe when I was caught up in my own ego, I was less prone to be able to see it in terms of their own woundedness? And how do I then begin to, at the very least, forgive and not continue to harbor ill will, resentment, retaliatory thoughts, and so on? Does that feel helpful, Jennifer? Yeah, I think you raise a really good point. And again, we have to allow ourselves some degree of compassion as we're learning, even in the midst of crucifixion, to how to do that. It's tough. It's tough.
Yeah, I just thank you so much. I probably bring this kind of thing up a lot. This theme just keeps, but I really do. I mean, I love how you just keep reminding us to really hold on to the fact that we are loved. There's that original goodness. All of that is so important. It's such an important step in the journey, and it's hard. So
yeah, I mean, it's hard to be the big person in the room sometimes, and when you realize everybody in the room is acting like a child, including yourself, and it's like, okay, how do I start to disengage and begin to be the adult in the room, the spiritual adult, as it were, But we learn by doing. Never forget that. Every time we fall, the trick is you just get up again. So don't expect perfection, but don't let the imperfection diminish your verve, your umption to do it, right? Christine, you're on. I'm not sure if I broke up there. Go right ahead, Christine.
You did a little bit, but you're back on.
Okay.
I think we'll just have to be aware of that and know that you're still connected.
Okay, yeah.
I just wanted to talk about how important it is to identify our feelings and really feel them. Growing up in a military family, I couldn't allow myself to be angry with my mother. And it wasn't until I was at 45, 46 that I finally realized how horribly angry I was at her. And then immediately to watch that anger turn inward to myself, that I should die. I wish I had had counseling earlier to realize this horrible thing I had been carrying. So self-destructive that I had not even been aware of.
Right. That's right. And that's, Christine, what I say over again in this chapter is it's becoming aware that is really the key to breaking through, naming it, to use that proverbial. And, naming it, we see that in the 12-step program. We see that, throughout scripture in various places. And we see that in even in the rite of exorcism, quite literally. We see Jesus, in Mark 5 saying, "Who are you? I want to know your name. And we are legion, for we are many." I mean, so there's a lot of demons being grappled with in that moment. So, don't diminish the efficacy of being able to name it as you have. It's very powerful breakthrough and a grace. Gerald, good morning.
Good morning, y'all. A very, very good session. And so much of what's been said this morning reminds me of the write-up that I guess Anna has put on about the upcoming session that you and Jonathan Montaldo will be doing on Merton. And what comes to mind is this beautiful statement, contemplative prayer grounded by emptiness of heart, but not of hope. When, and he quotes Merton here, it's dark and the dragons come and there is no more beer. I'm anxious. I'm looking forward. It seems that so much of what's been said this morning ties directly into what you guys are going to be telling us or working through with us. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that comment, Gerald. I'm looking forward. I'm going to just mute you because I can hear feedback there, but welcome. You're welcome to come back, Gerald. Yeah, I'm really looking forward. Jonathan Montaldo is visiting us here for about 10 days, and we're actually part of the point of his visit because he ran for a number of years a retreat center near Bellarmine. And I'm sorry, near Gethsemane. His Merton Center was found at Bellarmine, but he's quite versed in it, and we are looking to the possibility of establishing here essentially a Christian contemplative residency where people would be able to come as individuals or even couples for an extended period of time for a contemplative residency, and that could be a month or whatever. So he's coming here to help dialogue with us about what that would look like and what that would mean, and how we might have to restructure the very retreat house itself to accommodate long-term guests versus weekenders, as it were, and all that would imply. So it's something that I've had a vision for since I've gotten here, and there's a lot of complex ways that we have to work through bringing us to that point, a lot of questions to be asked. But since I've met him, he seems like the right person to help provide guidance. So he'll be giving that retreat while he's here. And he'll be giving 2 45-minute talks with little breaks, and then a sort of a lunch break. And then I'll be interviewing him for the second or for the third session. And then hopefully opening that up to some conversation as well. So he's a brilliant Merton scholar, and he knows his stuff. And he knows, I think, the Merton and not just Merton, sort of the spiritual leader and figure that know him in his person. So we'll see how that goes. Other thoughts or questions then? I wonder if we could move to our discussion of practice, which now goes back a couple weeks, I know, but see if any of you took up the challenge and want to share that. First, let me give you our practice for this coming week. My practice didn't get recorded there. I'm sorry. I thought it was. So for now, I'll provide that for you at the end. I'll give a quick search for that in my other document. But we can look at what essentially is last week's practice, in which I asked you to look at we were meditating on the prayer of confession that we pray here at St. Columba's. And I've asked if you would want to take a look at this and kind of do a kind of lectio on it, allowing yourselves to ruminate on the prayer throughout the week and seeing what emerges. So this is a prayer that I wrote for our community that we use for our Sunday morning liturgy, and thought it might be, in light of this examination of our demons, be something that was worthy of looking at and finding where each I can find that out for you, Carol. Let me see. It was 140, 144, 142 to 144. Not sure if that came through, but okay. So any thoughts? I don't know if I should leave that up there or if anybody wanted to share, if you've done any reflection on it, if there's anything that you wanted to share that stands out for you. Hi there, Richard. Go right ahead.
A thought in the moment about forgiving us for the harm we inflict on our planet. This is the start of the COP program in Glasgow, to which our Bishop Mark is representing presiding Bishop Curry, and his heart has been in this work for decades. But the nations are copping out of the COP program. China and India says they're not going to reduce anything. Our own legislature has prevented us from going there strong with a commitment to climate change. And from this process, at first I'm disillusioned and blaming them. And then I look at how expecting my government to fix everything instead of me doing what I can do is othering and blaming, and that really, if there's a cop out, we eco criminals have to reform our behavior. We have to do together. Find our satisfaction in each other and nurturing and not in plunder. I have to reform my pirate spirit. So that's, forgive me for what I do to this planet.
Well, Richard, I appreciate your saying so. I was also made aware recently that the whole notion of tracking one's carbon footprint was introduced by British Petroleum. And a lot of the subtle suggestion is, well, if you get individuals whose personal impact is minuscule compared to what industries like British Petroleum are doing, and get us all to focus on our own carbon footprint, we don't see the bigger offenders, because we're all focusing myopically. And I'm not suggesting we shouldn't take into account our carbon footprint. We should and we have to, but not as a way of not also attending to these larger issues and abuses and corruption. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright had said once that authentic democracy isn't a government. It's what happens when people are left free to govern themselves. And there's something insightful about that perspective, because it puts governing back in our hands as it's intended to be, and not leaving it to the institutions of government, as it were, to do that. So we have our work cut out for us, and it's just profoundly disheartening to keep coming to these what are we, COP26 now, and seeing nothing at all, really, but talk. And we know full well that this is not going to go well for us at all. And that in all likelihood, it's already far too late. And that the best we can do is hope to mitigate the worst of it. And the worst of it is pretty bad indeed. And so it's infuriating that governments keep pulling out for the sake of whatever is most immediately expedient for them, or that inconvenient truth, to come back to that idea. It's profoundly disheartening, but it says to us, if we're not doing something to address this, then we're not doing enough. And if we're not doing something that's making us uncomfortable, we're not doing enough as individuals. And so I would encourage you all to look seriously at what that means for you, even if that's starting to apply more pressure as we come up to this meeting in Glasgow. Very, very disheartening. Carol, please.
Okay, I'm glad I'm not going to be the last comment because I'm depressing. It's depressing again. I mean, we got at Holy Trinity, we got to listen to a Holocaust survivor, and his last words to us were, because one of the questions was, what would you leave us with? And he said, speak out early and speak out often, because by the time that wave took place, there was nothing we could do to stop the Holocaust. I mean, and even the troops on Normandy and all of that stuff. And that's how I feel about with climate change. I mean, now, like you said, it's almost too late. And how are we going to act as Christians to the destruction and the devastation? Are we going to, are we going to do the right thing, or are we going to be just like everybody else and be self-survivalists, or, and I don't even know what the right thing is. I deal a lot with Europe, and they are so far ahead of us. I mean, I live in Fairfax, Virginia, not Fairfax, California, and we don't even recycle because it's too much money. And we are one of the wealthiest counties in the nation, one of the top 10, but it's too much money. And, when I got my Prius, people said, you'll never get your money back for that. And I'm like, well, that's not why I'm buying the Prius. I'm just trying to do the right thing, but everybody's mindset is not like my mother's generation of, and the Great Depression and trying to collaborate and pull together. It's very much me, myself, and I. So, I mean, I'm with you, and I'm a follower rather than a leader, but I mean, so I'm always interested in what you have to say, because I do want to do the right thing and be Christ-like in what's coming and what is occurring now and what is coming down the path. So, because as a science person, I don't think it's going to end well either. So.
No, it's not. And Carol, as you're talking, I'm often, reminded of that, and I'm paraphrasing, but that Genesis text dealing with Noah and the ark, and people were eating and drinking and making merry right up to the day of the flood. And I mean, yeah, it's a mythological story, but wow, does that speak truth to the human condition? Because it's exactly what we're doing, And it's not going to just be this slow, gradual progression. It's like snowflakes on a dead branch. It's going to take that one final wave of them tumbling down essentially overnight. What's that?
You froze again. So it's snowflakes on a dying branch.
Yeah, that it just takes that one snowflake to finally snap the branch. And I think that's what's going to happen environmentally. We're going to be progressing and progressing until it just collapses.
Yeah. And we're here in the Washington, D.C. area, but my sister-in-law, they have a house in Cambridge, which is on the eastern shore of Maryland, and it got flooded last night. I mean, it's just unheard of. In Alexandria, Virginia, got flooded. The Potomac River flooded the banks over the tidal basin where all the cherry trees are. That doesn't happen, but it's going to happen now on a regular basis. So,
right, indeed. Carl, please.
So Krista Tippett's guest last week in our On Being podcast was Catherine Aho, who's a distinguished climate scientist who does very, very esoteric mathematical modeling of the impact of climate change on specific locations. And Catherine is also a very born-again evangelical Christian. And so for the last 30 or so years since she began her career as a scientist and has published literally hundreds of papers on climate change, she has been speaking to evangelical groups now since she married a Texan. She grew up in Southern Ontario. She speaks to evangelical groups throughout the nation, but mainly in Texas, and it's often a very hostile audience. And her message, she keeps track of the questions that she's asked. And, in the beginning, there were lots and lots of different kinds of questions. But in the last few years, she says, the one question that just has come to dominate her meetings with evangelical groups, in which she tries to show that belief in science is consistent with a fervent and even fundamentalist conception of Christianity. The one question that dominates is there hope? And she, as a climate scientist, says, yes, there are wonderful things happening. She says, when we look at the newspapers, it looks like something like 90% of the articles are negative. So the world is going to pot and nothing is happening and the world leaders aren't doing anything. And the climate and, you know, the climate gases are piling up and they're not, and global warming is, he said, if you look at the actual modeling, that's not what's happening. We have managed to slow things down, not to the point we need to, but we're on a trajectory, and it is not the trajectory we were on 30 years ago when she started her work. So the message that she gives to evangelical groups, part of the resistance they have to believing in climate change or to being doubtful about it is that they feel so hopeless about it. And she said that is the wrong attitude. For example, just this week, there was a lot of pressure on insurance companies to stop insuring fossil fuel projects. And the leaders of the major fossil fuel corporations like British Petroleum were hauled before Congress and grilled mercilessly about their climate change lies in the 90s and early 2000s. And people kind of dismissed all of that, but there is hope out there. And she says, climate change is still in our hands. So I wanted to just bring that. And if any of you are interested, it's Krista Tippett's On Being podcast from last week. I think she releases it on Fridays with Catherine Viejo. So I just wanted to bring that to you so we don't end in a note of gloom.
Thank you, Carl. I hope you're right about that. Richard, please.
Thank you so much, Carl.
Supporting what Catherine, who is an actual client.
Thank you, Carl, for that note. It's also reflected by one of the most conservative Catholic colleges, Gonzaga, has started an institute for addressing climate change, and they're having a program very shortly, at which Mary Evelyn Tucker of the Yale Forum will present. And when someone that conservative gets involved, and the divestment movement has diverted $4 trillion from institutional investment in fossil fuel companies. So there is movement, and thank you, Carl, for redirecting me. And Paloma had a comment, if it's all right.
I just wanted to say that Catherine Hayhoe was invited to speak in our own diocese at the diaconate school as a last year, and is just a fabulous, fabulous presenter. But also, I just wanted to ask everyone's prayers as the Glasgow is beginning this week. I think part of the hope is everyone who's attuned and going to this, but also tuning into it. And I think we can help build the field ourselves spiritually and energetically. There's so much more to say, but the power of this group holding the intentions of this week is really my hope.
Thank you, Paloma. Any other comments or thoughts, questions, reflections? All right. Well, as always, it's a real joy for me to be with you all. And I missed you the last couple of weeks. It's been a very poignant time. Fernando and I have moved permanently into the vicarage here, managed after a very difficult year and a half to sell our former home. And we've been living here since November of 2019, but to sort of be able to offload the burden of that other house and to really find ourselves settling in here full time is both chaotic and crazy. Every room of the vicarage looks like you threw a hand grenade in it right now, but we'll be slowly kind of cleaning that up and getting ourselves in order, and just really so joyful to be so deeply integrated into the local community here, ever more so. So thanks for your patience in the last couple of weeks as I've been making that very time consuming and chaotic transition. But I look forward to seeing you all 1 week from today. It's hard to believe we're moving into November. I don't know like where this year even went. So go with my blessing and with my peace. And I bid you Ben Christinet in the name of the 3 in 1 and 1 in 3. And I look forward to seeing you all very soon.